Elias Thornton stood perfectly still as the crowd gathered around his front porch, their faces twisted with an anger he couldn't quite understand. Someone had painted "thief" across his mailbox in red letters that dripped like blood in the Texas heat. The 70-year-old rancher held a manila envelope in his weathered hands, the same envelope that had arrived with no return address 3 days ago. Inside were photocopies of documents he'd never seen before, papers that somehow proved he'd been living a lie for 47 years. Maya Collins stepped forward from the crowd, her designer heels clicking against the wooden steps of his porch, her face flushed with righteous fury. The strange part wasn't the accusation or even the hostile crowd. The strange part was that Elias had been expecting this moment his entire adult life. Maya Collins had arrived in Millbrook County 6 months ago with a briefcase full of legal documents and a reputation for taking down old money families who thought they were untouchable. The town had embraced her like a savior, especially after she'd helped 3 families recover land they claimed had been stolen from their grandparents during the Dust Bowl. Her law office sat in the heart of downtown, directly across from the courthouse, where she'd won every case she'd brought to trial. The manila envelope had appeared on Elias's doorstep on a Tuesday morning, wedged between the screen door and the frame like someone had placed it there in the middle of the night. No postmark, no delivery confirmation, just his name written in block letters across the front. Inside were copies of deeds, surveys, and property records dating back to 1978, the year his father had supposedly purchased the ranch from the Millbrook Family Trust. Supposedly. The documents in the envelope told a different story. According to these papers, his father had never legally purchased anything. The land had been held in trust for the descendants of Thomas Millbrook, the town's founder, and Elias Thornton was nothing more than a squatter who'd built a 47-year legacy on stolen ground. But that wasn't the part that made his hands shake as he read through the documents for the 3rd time. The part that made his blood run cold was the signature at the bottom of the original trust document, a signature he recognized, written in his father's careful handwriting, acknowledging that he was merely a caretaker of the land until the rightful heirs could be located. His father had known. His father had always known. Now Maya stood on his porch, her auburn hair whipping in the desert wind, her green eyes blazing with the kind of fury that only came from absolute certainty. Behind her, Dutch Richardson shifted uncomfortably, his sheriff's badge catching the afternoon sun. The man looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, but the law was the law, and Maya Collins had the law on her side. "Mr. Thornton," Maya said, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd, "I'm here representing the true heirs of this property. You have 72 hours to vacate these premises." Elias looked down at the envelope in his hands, then back at the woman who was about to destroy everything he'd ever known. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled across the clear blue sky, though no storm clouds were visible on the horizon. Maya stepped closer, her polished legal briefcase clicking open with sharp precision. The crowd behind her pressed forward, sensing blood in the water like sharks circling wounded prey. 72 hours might be generous, Maya continued, pulling out a thick stack of papers. "These documents prove beyond any shadow of doubt that your family has been illegally occupying this land since 1978. The Millbrook Trust never authorized any sale to your father." Elias studied her face, noting the way her left eye twitched when she spoke about the trust. Something about her certainty felt rehearsed, like she'd practiced this confrontation in front of a mirror. He'd seen that same expression on his father's face whenever someone asked too many questions about the early days of the ranch. "Miss Collins," Elias said quietly, his voice carrying despite its softness, "you seem mighty sure about those papers. Mind telling me who gave them to you?" The question hit its mark. Maya's confident expression flickered for just a moment before she recovered. "That's irrelevant. What matters is that these documents are authentic, verified by 3 separate handwriting experts and a forensic document analyst." Sheriff Richardson stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun belt, more from nervous habit than any real threat. "Elias, you know I don't want to do this the hard way. Maya's got court orders, property surveys, the whole 9 yards. Maybe it's time to call your lawyer." "Already did," Elias replied, reaching into his shirt pocket. He pulled out a business card, worn and yellowed with age. "Called him yesterday soon as I got that envelope. Funny thing, though, he's been dead for 15 years. The crowd murmured uneasily. Maya's eyes narrowed as she snatched the card from his weathered hand. The name printed in faded blue ink read, "Harrison Wells, property attorney, Millbrook County." Below that, a phone number with an area code that hadn't been used in this part of Texas since the early 1990s. "Where did you get this?" Maya demanded, her professional composure cracking slightly. "Same place I got everything else about this land," Elias said. "From my father's private safe. Found it right next to the deed you say doesn't exist." Maya's face flushed red. She turned to address the crowd, her voice rising with each word. "He's stalling. This is exactly what wealthy landowners do when they're caught. They produce mysterious documents, claim their lawyers are dead. Anything to avoid facing the truth." Someone in the crowd shouted agreement. Others nodded, their faces hardening with collective anger. These were people who'd struggled to make ends meet while watching Elias run cattle on prime grazing land that could have been subdivided and sold to families who actually needed homes. But Elias wasn't looking at the crowd anymore. His attention had shifted to a black sedan parked at the end of his long driveway, its windows tinted dark enough to hide whoever sat inside. The car hadn't been there when the crowd first arrived, and its license plates were from out of state. "Miss Collins," he said, pointing toward the sedan. "That wouldn't happen to be your ride, would it?" Maya followed his gaze, and for the first time since arriving, genuine surprise crossed her features. "I've never seen that car before." The sedan's engine started with a low rumble, and it began backing slowly down the gravel road. As it turned around, Elias caught a glimpse of the driver, a man in an expensive suit who definitely wasn't from Millbrook County. "Seems like somebody's been watching our little gathering," Elias said, his voice taking on an edge it hadn't held before. "Question is, who's really pulling the strings here?" The crowd's energy shifted from righteous anger to uncomfortable confusion as the black sedan disappeared around the bend. Maya quickly regained her composure, but Elias noticed how her hands trembled slightly as she shuffled through her documents. "Don't let him distract you," she called out to the crowd. "This is exactly what con artists do when they're cornered. They point at random cars, mention dead lawyers, anything to confuse the real issue." But Dutch Richardson wasn't buying it anymore. The sheriff had grown up in Millbrook County, and he'd known Elias since they were kids playing baseball behind the old grain elevator. Something about this whole situation felt off, like a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit together. "Maya," Dutch said carefully, "maybe we should slow down here. That business card, the sedan. It's starting to feel like there's more to this story." Maya's green eyes flashed with fury as she whirled on the sheriff. "Are you kidding me right now? I have legal documents. I have court orders." "What more do you need?" "I need to understand why someone's been watching us," Dutch replied, his voice steady. "And I need to know who really wants this land and why." Elias walked to the edge of his porch and sat down on the wooden steps, his movements deliberate and calm despite the chaos swirling around him. He pulled out a worn leather wallet from his back pocket and extracted a folded piece of paper that looked like it had been read hundreds of times. "Sheriff," he said, holding up the paper, "this here's a letter my father wrote me before he died. Never made much sense until today." Maya lunged forward, trying to snatch the letter, but Elias held it just out of her reach. "Easy there, counselor. This isn't going anywhere." He unfolded the paper with careful precision, his weathered fingers tracing the handwritten lines. "Dear Elias, if you're reading this, then someone's finally come for the land. When they do, remember that the truth isn't always in the documents they show you. Sometimes the real truth is buried, where only family knows to look." "Family riddles and cryptic messages," Maya scoffed, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "This is getting ridiculous." "My father wasn't much for riddles," Elias continued. "He was a practical man, but he knew something was coming, and he prepared for it." He looked directly at Maya. "Question is, who told you about those documents in my envelope? Because I'm betting you didn't just stumble across them in some dusty courthouse file." The crowd had grown quieter, sensing that the simple story they'd been told was becoming something more complicated. Mrs. Henderson from the general store stepped forward, her face creased with worry. "Elias, honey, we just want what's fair. If the land belongs to the Millbrook heirs, then that's how it should be. But if there's something else going on, there's always something else going on," Elias said, standing up and brushing dust from his jeans. "The question is whether y'all are going to be part of the solution or part of the problem." Maya's phone buzzed loudly in the tense silence. She glanced at the screen, and her face went pale. Whatever message she'd received clearly wasn't what she'd been expecting. "I have to make a call," she announced abruptly, stepping away from the crowd. As she walked toward her car, Elias could hear her speaking in urgent whispers to whoever was on the other end. Dutch Richardson moved closer to Elias, lowering his voice. "You want to tell me what's really going on here?" Elias looked at his childhood friend, weighing his words carefully. "Dutch, how long have you known me?" 63 years, give or take. "And in all that time, have I ever lied to you about anything important?" "No, you haven't." "Then trust me when I tell you that losing this land isn't the worst thing that could happen to this town." Elias glanced toward Maya, who was still on her phone, her voice growing more agitated. "The worst thing would be finding out who really wants it, and why." Maya finished her phone call and walked back toward the group, her face set in hard lines that hadn't been there before. The confident attorney who'd arrived ready to serve legal papers had been replaced by someone who looked like she'd just received very bad news. "Change of plans," she announced, her voice tight, with barely controlled frustration. "We're moving up the timeline. Mr. Thornton, you now have 24 hours to vacate the premises." Dutch Richardson straightened up, his hand instinctively moving toward his badge. "Hold on there. Counselor, you can't just change court orders on a whim. That's not how the law works." "The law works however my clients need it to work," Maya snapped, then immediately seemed to regret her words. "I mean, new information has come to light that requires immediate action." Elias remained seated on his porch steps, but his eyes had sharpened considerably. "What kind of new information?" Maya hesitated, clearly weighing how much to reveal. "Environmental concerns. My clients have discovered potential contamination issues that require immediate assessment of the property." "That's interesting," Elias said slowly, "because just yesterday the county environmental office told me this land had the cleanest water table in the region. Matter of fact, they said it was so clean they wanted to do a geological survey." The crowd murmured with confusion. Mrs. Henderson spoke up again, her voice worried. "What kind of contamination are we talking about here? My grandchildren play in the creek that runs through Elias's property." Maya's jaw clenched. "That's classified information pending the official assessment." "Classified by who?" Dutch demanded. "The county health department? The state environmental agency? Because I'm the sheriff of this county, and nobody's told me about any contamination concerns." "By my clients," Maya said, her voice rising slightly. "The legitimate owners of this property have every right to protect their interests." Elias stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. "Miss Collins, in my 70 years on this earth, I've learned that when someone starts talking about protecting their interests, it usually means they're about to do something that hurts everybody else." "Your 70 years don't mean anything when you've been living on stolen land," Maya shouted, finally losing her composure. "You think just because you're old and everybody likes you that you can get away with this? Well, those days are over." The crowd stepped back at her outburst. Even her own legal assistant, who'd been quietly taking notes, looked shocked at the venom in her voice. Dutch moved between Maya and Elias, his sheriff's training kicking in. "Everybody needs to calm down right now." But Elias wasn't looking at Maya anymore. His attention had shifted to something behind the crowd. A convoy of 3 white SUVs was driving up his long gravel driveway, kicking up dust clouds in their wake. The vehicles moved with military precision, staying exactly 20 feet apart. "Expecting company, Miss Collins?" Elias asked. Maya turned to look, and the color drained from her face. "They're not supposed to be here yet." "Who's not supposed to be here?" Dutch demanded. The lead SUV came to a stop about 50 yards from the house, and its engine shut off. The other 2 vehicles positioned themselves strategically, one blocking the main road and the other covering the back pasture access. Men in dark suits began emerging from the vehicles, but they stayed near their cars, clearly waiting for some kind of signal. "Miss Collins," Elias said, his voice deadly quiet, "I think it's time you told these good people who your real clients are. Because those boys don't look like any Millbrook heirs I've ever seen." Maya's hands were shaking now as she gripped her briefcase. The confident legal eagle who'd arrived to serve papers had been replaced by someone who looked terrified of her own allies. "This wasn't supposed to happen like this," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "What wasn't supposed to happen like this?" Dutch pressed, his hand now resting on his service weapon. But before Maya could answer, one of the men from the SUVs started walking toward them, and Elias recognized him immediately as the driver of the black sedan that had been watching them earlier. The man approaching from the SUVs wore a suit that probably cost more than most people in Millbrook County made in a month. His face was tanned and professional, the kind of tan that came from golf courses rather than honest work under the Texas sun. As he got closer, Elias could see a small pin on his lapel, a corporate logo he didn't recognize but somehow found familiar. "Ms. Collins," the man called out, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone used to getting his way. "We agreed you'd have this situation resolved before we arrived." Maya's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. "The timeline changed, Mr. Blackwood. There were complications." Cornelius Blackwood. Elias had heard that name before, whispered in conversations at the diner, mentioned in passing by the banker who'd been trying to get him to refinance his property for the past 2 years. Blackwood Development, one of those big companies that showed up in small towns with promises of progress and jobs, then left behind empty lots and broken communities. "Complications," Blackwood repeated, his eyes scanning the crowd of townspeople like they were obstacles to be removed. "I see one old man and a handful of local yokels. That hardly seems complicated." Dutch Richardson stepped forward, his sheriff's badge catching the sunlight. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification and an explanation of what you're doing here." Blackwood barely glanced at Dutch before dismissing him entirely. "Sheriff, this is a private property matter. We have all the necessary legal documentation." "Actually," Elias said, standing up and brushing dust from his jeans, "I don't think you do." For the first time, Blackwood looked directly at Elias, and something passed between the two men, a recognition that went deeper than their current confrontation. "Mr. Thornton, I was hoping we could handle this matter without meeting face to face." "I bet you were," Elias replied. "But since you're here, why don't you tell these good people what you really want with my land?" Blackwood's professional smile never wavered, but his eyes hardened. "Your land? According to every legal document we've reviewed, this property belongs to the Millbrook Trust, which my company now represents." "Funny thing about that trust," Elias said, reaching into his shirt pocket again. "I did some research after Miss Collins showed up with her papers. Turns out the Millbrook Trust was dissolved in 1982, and all its assets were transferred to the surviving family members." Maya's eyes widened. "That's impossible. I verified those documents myself." "You verified documents that someone wanted you to see," Elias corrected. "But you never looked at the dissolution papers filed with the state, probably because they're buried pretty deep in the archives, and you'd have to know exactly where to look." Blackwood's calm facade cracked slightly. "Mr. Thornton, you're obviously a resourceful man, but legal technicalities won't change the fundamental facts. This land has strategic value that extends beyond simple property ownership." "Strategic value," Dutch repeated, his voice skeptical. "For what?" "Water rights," Elias answered before Blackwood could respond. "This land sits on top of the largest natural aquifer in this part of Texas. With the drought getting worse every year, water's about to become more valuable than oil." The crowd murmured uneasily. Most of them depended on wells for their daily water needs, and the idea of losing access to clean groundwater was terrifying. Maya looked back and forth between Blackwood and Elias, realization dawning on her face. "You lied to me. You told me this was about property inheritance, about justice for the Millbrook family. I told you what you needed to hear to do your job," Blackwood replied coldly. "Which I might add, you've failed to do." That was when Maya finally snapped. All the professional composure, all the legal training, all the careful control she'd maintained throughout her career evaporated in a single moment of pure rage. "This ain't your land anymore, old man," she screamed at Elias, her voice cracking with fury and humiliation. "You hear me? This ain't your land anymore. We have the papers, we have the law, we have everything we need to take it from you." The words hung in the air like a curse, and in the silence that followed, everyone could see that Maya Collins had just realized she'd been played by everyone, Blackwood, Elias, and maybe even herself. But the most frightening thing was the smile that slowly spread across Elias Thornton's weathered face, like he'd been waiting his entire life to hear those exact words. Elias reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small metal key, tarnished with age but still solid. The townspeople watched in silence as he walked to a weathered oak tree near his porch, knelt down and began brushing away decades of accumulated dirt and leaves from its base. "What are you doing?" Blackwood demanded, his corporate composure finally starting to crack. "Something my father taught me when I was 12, Elias replied, inserting the key into what appeared to be a small metal box buried among the tree roots. "He said that when powerful men come for what you have, you better have proof they can't destroy or steal." The metal box opened with a rusty click, revealing a waterproof container wrapped in plastic. He could almost hear his father's voice from 30 years ago. "Son, when they come for what's ours, you make sure you have something they can't steal or burn." The old man had been right about everything. Inside were documents, photographs, and what looked like original survey maps dating back to the 1800s. Maya stared at the container, her earlier confidence completely shattered. Those papers could be anything. They could be fakes. Could be, Elias agreed, pulling out a thick manila folder. "Except these aren't copies like the ones you showed me. These are originals, with official seals, notarized signatures, and something your documents don't have." "Which is what?" Blackwood asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be good. "Proof that the Millbrook Trust never owned this land in the first place." Elias opened the folder carefully, revealing a deed with elaborate calligraphy and official stamps. "This property was purchased directly from the federal government in 1876 by my great-grandfather, Samuel Thornton. The Millbrook family owned the land to the east, not this parcel." Dutch Richardson moved closer to examine the documents, his expression growing more serious with each page he reviewed. "Elias, these look legitimate. More than legitimate. They look like the originals I've seen in the courthouse vault." "That's because they are the originals," Elias said. "The documents in the courthouse are copies. My family has been keeping the real papers safe for 4 generations, waiting for the day someone would try exactly what you're trying now, Mr. Blackwood." Blackwood's expression darkened, but his voice remained steady. "Even if those documents are authentic, water rights are a separate matter entirely. The state of Texas has eminent domain authority over all underground water resources." "You're absolutely right," Elias said, his smile growing wider. "Which is why I contacted the State Environmental Protection Agency 3 months ago, as soon as I heard Blackwood Development was sniffing around Millbrook County." The crowd shifted nervously, sensing that something important was about to be revealed. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her face creased with worry. "Elias, what did you tell them?" "I told them that someone was planning to drill unauthorized wells on protected watershed land," Elias replied. "See, this aquifer isn't just valuable because it holds water. It's valuable because it's been designated as a federal emergency water reserve since 1987. Any commercial drilling requires congressional approval." Maya's hands began to shake as the full scope of her situation became clear. You knew all along what this was really about. "Miss Collins, my father didn't just leave me land and documents. He left me 47 years of stories about men like Mr. Blackwood who show up in small towns with big promises and leave nothing but empty holes in the ground." Blackwood pulled out his phone and began speaking in urgent whispers to someone on the other end. The men by the SUVs straightened up, clearly receiving new instructions through their earpieces. "Mr. Thornton," Blackwood said after ending his call, "you've created a very complicated situation for a lot of very powerful people. I hope you understand the implications of what you're doing." "I understand perfectly," Elias replied. "The question is whether these good people understand what you're really threatening them with." Dutch Richardson's hand moved to his service weapon as the tension in the air became almost unbearable. "Mr. Blackwood, I think it's time for you and your associates to leave." "Sheriff, we're not going anywhere until this matter is resolved to our satisfaction," Blackwood said, his corporate mask finally slipping completely away to reveal something much more dangerous underneath. Blackwood gestured to his men, and they began moving closer to the crowd with practiced intimidation tactics. These weren't lawyers or business associates. These were security contractors, the kind of men who specialized in making problems disappear quietly. "Sheriff Richardson," Blackwood continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone who'd bought and sold small-town officials before. "I think you'll find that your department's annual budget depends heavily on state grants that my company helps administrate." Dutch's face hardened, but before he could respond, Mrs. Henderson's cell phone began ringing loudly. Then another phone in the crowd started buzzing. Within seconds, half the townspeople were receiving calls or text messages simultaneously. "What the hell?" someone called out from the back of the group. Mrs. Henderson answered her phone, the color draining from her cheeks as she listened. "It's the bank," she said to the crowd. "They're calling in my loan. Effective immediately." "Mine too," called out Jim Watson, who owned the feed store. "They say there's been a reassessment of risk factors in the region." More phones kept ringing. The grocery store owner, the mechanic, the woman who ran the daycare center. One by one, the people who'd come to drive Elias off his land were discovering that their own financial lives were suddenly under attack. Quite a coincidence, Blackwood said with a cold smile. It seems like Millbrook County has become a very risky place to do business. Maya watched the chaos unfolding around her with growing horror. This isn't what we agreed to. You said this was about property rights, about legitimate legal claims. Miss Collins, you agreed to do a job for a fee. The methods we use to ensure cooperation from local communities are not your concern. You're threatening these people's livelihoods, Maya shouted. Their homes, their businesses, everything they've worked for. I'm protecting my investment, Blackwood replied. Water rights in Texas are worth approximately $47 billion annually. The aquifer under Mr. Thornton's property represents roughly 2% of that market. Do you really think I'm going to let one stubborn old man and a handful of farmers stand in the way of a $900 million development project? The townspeople fell silent, finally understanding the true scale of what they were facing. These weren't property disputes or legal technicalities. This was corporate warfare, and they'd been caught in the crossfire. Dutch Richardson stepped forward, his badge reflecting the afternoon sun. Mr. Blackwood, you just admitted to financial coercion and intimidation tactics against the citizens of my county. That's extortion, and it's a felony. Sheriff, I think you'll find that legitimate business practices are perfectly legal, even when they result in unfortunate consequences for people who choose to oppose progress. That was when Elias spoke up again, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Mr. Blackwood, there's one more thing you should know about that Federal Water Reserve designation. Blackwood turned toward him, irritation flashing across his features. What now, old man? It comes with automatic federal protection status, which means that as of 3 days ago, when I filed the official complaint, this entire area is under federal investigation for environmental crimes. Elias pulled out his phone and showed the screen to the crowd. I've been recording this entire conversation, including your admission of financial coercion and your threat to exploit protected water resources. Blackwood's corporate composure finally cracked completely. You think some recording is going to stop what's already in motion? You think the federal government cares about one old man and his land? No, Elias said quietly, but they care about $900 million in illegal water extraction, and they especially care when that operation is being funded by foreign investors who don't have extraction permits. For the first time since arriving, uncertainty flickered across Blackwood's features. How did you? My father taught me to do my homework, Mr. Blackwood. Just like he taught me that when someone comes for your land, they're never really after the land itself. They're after what's under it, around it, or flowing through it. Maya stared at Elias with a mixture of admiration and horror, finally understanding that she'd been played by everyone in this situation, including the old man she'd tried to destroy. Dear God, she whispered, what have I done? 3 federal vehicles appeared at the end of Elias's driveway before Blackwood could respond to his question about foreign investors. The agents who emerged wore the unmistakable uniforms of the Environmental Protection Agency, accompanied by federal marshals whose presence immediately changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Agent Sarah Chen approached the group with crisp authority, her badge clearly visible. Mr. Blackwood, you're under arrest for conspiracy to violate the Federal Water Protection Act, financial coercion, and attempting to defraud the United States government of protected natural resources. Blackwood's men stepped back as the federal marshals moved forward with practiced efficiency. The corporate executive who'd arrived with such confidence was now being handcuffed in front of the entire town. This is a mistake, Blackwood protested as the cuffs clicked into place. My lawyers will have me out within hours. Your lawyers are currently being arrested in Dallas for their involvement in the forged trust documents, Agent Chen replied. The foreign investment consortium you're working for has been under federal investigation for 18 months. Mr. Thornton's recording just provided the final evidence we needed. Maya stood frozen, watching her entire career dissolve before her eyes. Agent Chen, I need to cooperate. I was manipulated into participating in this fraud. I can provide evidence, testimony, whatever you need. Miss Collins, you'll have that opportunity during your deposition, the agent replied. Right now, we need to secure this property as a federal crime scene. As the federal agents led Blackwood and his associates away, the townspeople began to understand the full scope of what had almost happened to their community. The loan calls had been illegal intimidation tactics. The forged documents had been part of a multi-state fraud operation. They'd been used as pawns in a scheme that would have destroyed not just Elias's ranch, but the entire region's water supply. Mrs. Henderson approached Elias with tears in her eyes. "Elias, honey, we're so sorry. We believed her lies. We turned against you. If you hadn't been prepared." "Mrs. Henderson," Elias said gently, "my father used to say that good people can be fooled by bad people. But that doesn't make them bad people. Y'all were trying to do what you thought was right." Dutch Richardson removed his hat and ran his hands through his graying hair. "Elias, how long have you known this was coming?" "About 6 months," Elias replied. "Started getting calls from strangers asking about my land, my water rights, whether I'd ever considered selling. Then Maya showed up, and I knew exactly what my father had been preparing me for my whole life." "Why didn't you tell us?" Jim Watson asked. "Because I needed them to make the first move," Elias explained. "I needed them to show their hand completely before I could prove what they were really after. If I'd warned y'all too early, they would have just changed their approach." Agent Chen finished securing the scene and walked back toward Elias. "Mr. Thornton, the federal government owes you a debt of gratitude. Your actions prevented what could have been an environmental disaster affecting 3 counties. Just protecting what my family built," Elias said simply. As daylight softened over Millbrook County, the federal vehicles departed with their prisoners. The townspeople gradually dispersed, many stopping to apologize to Elias before heading home. Maya was driven away in a federal car, her legal career finished, and her life forever changed by the consequences of her actions. Dutch Richardson was the last to leave, shaking Elias's hand on the porch where the confrontation had begun. "You saved this town," the sheriff said. "This town saved itself," Elias replied. "It just took a while to remember who the real enemies were." 6 months later, Millbrook County's water supply remained secure. Blackwood Development was under federal indictment, and Elias Thornton continued raising cattle on land that had belonged to his family for 4 generations. The only reminder of that terrible day was a small plaque by the oak tree, commemorating the federal protection status that would preserve the aquifer forever. Sometimes the old ways really were the best ways, especially when they were backed by federal law and a recording device. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale, where justice and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.